Hello. This lecture begins a series of lectures concerning Confucianism, focusing particularly on its conception of virtue. And so the question would be how to live a virtuous life according to Confucius and the Confucian tradition. It's helpful to give a bit of background here about who Confucius was, and a little bit to say, first of all, about his name. So Confucius is a Latinized version of his name. Now scholars typically use the actual Chinese version, Kongzi, which is also not necessarily his name, but rather the Z part is the title, so Master Kong. And then Kong would be what we would call his last name, which actually comes first. So I'll often slip back and forth between Confucius and Kongzi. One last thing to note there is that we say in English Confucianism, but that's not actually a Chinese construction. The actual followers of Confucius would always refer to themselves as Ruist. So this character in Chinese, Ru, would mean scholar or learned person. Okay, so enough about those matters. We don't have a ton of facts concerning his biography. He comes a bit before a few of the thinkers that you might study in Western philosophy, such as Socrates. He's born in Shandong Peninsula in northeastern China. Chinese history gets divided up into different periods, so he's born and lives in the spring and autumn period. But the very end of his life is actually the last 2 years are part of the Warring States period. That name gives a lot away. We have warring states, a lot of independent principalities, various kings fighting for control over land and resources. And so Confucius's life, like several of his followers, was a time of great strife, great conflict. So this is something to think about to get an understanding of what motivates Confucius and what might explain some of the ideas that he develops or focuses on. So we can say that his main question would be, how do we make society better? This is one understanding. You could say his main question is something else. We're also focused on the question, how does an individual cultivate themselves and make themselves better? It's important to see that those two different questions, how do we make society better? How does an individual make themselves better? Those are intimately connected for Confucius. The connection is basically that various institutions, so, government, today we have corporations, religious institutions. These aren't natural entities. They're not just developed independently of what human beings do. Rather, for Confucius, they are conventional. They are made by individuals. And so this is something to keep in mind when we turn to look at his views about ritual. So rituals are made by human beings in the context of institutions often. And so if we want to make society better, society is made up of a bunch of institutions, we need to figure out how to make human beings better. This is going to be crucial for looking at how he talks about tradition. And so, many thinkers that emphasize tradition just think, tradition is natural. It's kind of the God-given way of how things should be. That's not Confucius's view, because tradition is shaped by individuals first and foremost. And so a few other things about Confucius. He was an official of various sorts for different, kings and different people, different politicians, and had a lot of expert knowledge in rituals, ceremonies, and so on. And so he actually uses that knowledge in composing various works or recording or editing various scholarly works about ancient history, ancient ritual, and so on. But he kind of retires from this official life and becomes primarily a teacher. And he ends up having 77 disciples, direct disciples. And then, of course, that spawns a great tradition. In the Warring States period, after he has died, some of these disciples get together and collect anecdotes, sayings, and these get compiled in a work called the Lunyu, which we call the Anoex. And basically, Lunyu means something like selected speeches, selected or edited things said. And then Anoex is kind of similar, but it's more like things gathered up. And so that's the work that we're going to be looking at. So now let's get a brief look at some of the inheritors of the Confucian tradition. These would include many more people than this, but in the Warring States period, you have two thinkers, Menzi and Xunzi. For those two philosophers offer competing views about human nature, and Mencius kind of wins out, I think, for the most part, of how people follow in the Confucian tradition. And then many years later, the Song Dynasty, you have Neo-Confucianism, and there's many representatives there. I think the one to highlight is Jushi. And Jushi kind of systematizes a lot of Confucian thought and also edits a bunch of books and kind of sets the curriculum for civil service examinations. He wasn't necessarily putting this stuff together because he wanted to make that curriculum, but it becomes adopted by others. Once we get to the Ming Dynasty, we see someone that's much opposed to Jushi, Wang Yangming. So Wang Yangming will emphasize a lot less this sort of scholarly approach that Jushi undertakes. So that's kind of a brief overview of where Confucianism goes, leaving a lot out. Now, let's look at some broad themes of Confucianism. I said earlier that two questions are, how do we make society better? How do we make individuals better? And so the focus is often going to be on individuals because they make up society. And so individuals are to be made better through a process that is, we can call self-cultivation. So this is going to be a process of learning from ancient traditions, learning from various teachers, but then acting on that knowledge and cultivating certain feelings that are appropriate to have in certain situations. So we'll say a bit more on the next slide about that. Then there's another theme of reviving tradition and various rituals. So it's a focus on traditions and rituals which may or may not be traditional. And so the thought here is that things were better in the past. So there's that expressed often by Confucius that, these much more ancient kings had stable societies. You want to figure out, how are they able to accomplish that? What sorts of traditions and rituals did they use to help individuals develop and create a stable society? Now, I should add here that Confucius's thought is not that we should just adopt or accept these traditions and rituals wholesale, just as they were practiced in the past, but rather we want to find the best parts of that ancient tradition and also identify why certain traditions were used, what purpose did they serve. And so then when we want to apply that ancient thought to today, then we figure out, well, how do we accomplish those same purposes, maybe something like those ancient rituals, maybe something slightly different. Another thing to note here is that the ritual that's focused on is very broad. It would include things that would count as etiquette. So don't think just like religious practice. It's also going to involve social norms, I think is a great way to put it. How do we engage with each other, even just kind of one-on-one, making small talk? What are certain norms governing that sort of interaction? And the thought here is that we should really focus on ritual because we inevitably have those kinds of social norms. And so we ought to figure out how to engage in these situations where there's norms governing them, how to engage in them in the best possible way to develop as better human beings. Now, the final theme to focus on is this focus on family. So this might also be expressed by the term partialism. This is the thought that there's more of a duty, or it's more morally right to do things for your family rather than just strangers. Of course, there is going to be this thought that you should, help strangers, but when you're kind of faced with a situation where you can do one or the other, typically, not always, typically you're going to focus on the family. And the basic reasoning there is that if we're focused on self-cultivation, what is the way in which a person is cultivated or develops? How are they mostly developed? Well, by their family. And various family units are what make up society as a whole. So it's also important for how we make society better. So now I just want to say a brief bit about self-cultivation and kind of its use as a metaphor, and then follow up in the next slide and then conclude with another metaphor. So this metaphor of self-cultivation is an agricultural metaphor. We begin as a sort of sprout from a seed, and that we grow, get taller, develop, and acquire new capacities and abilities. So plants kind of grow on their own in some sense, but they also require water and light and so on. And that's going to be similar for human beings. But the thought is that the term self-cultivation is particularly applicable to human beings because we can make choices about how we go about developing ourselves. And so we can make choices to internalize proper action, proper thinking about different situations and various feelings. And so we can cultivate ourselves, change the direction that we might be going in. So one way to think about this is the notion of transformation. Change who you are in some deep way. And so Confucius will often indicate things here about learning as crucial to this process. But learning is also to be supplemented by reflection or thinking about what you've learned, which is emphasized several times in the Analects. Now, what you're learning, for the most part, in the Confucian tradition is often what the sages have said, going back before Confucius even. And so we might now want to understand, well, why do we need to pay attention to ancient wisdom? And so this brings us to our second metaphor. The second metaphor is the term Tao. So you're probably familiar with Taoism, but the term in Taoism is shared by Confucianism. There's also in Confucianism an emphasis on Tao, which we can translate as way. So there's many different kind of meanings of this term. And so way is an appropriate, I think, translation because it can indicate just a path or a road, quite literally just a way to get from point A to point B, walking or driving or what have you. You can use this term way in English figuratively to say how you accomplish something. So I can tell you the way to write the paper for this class. Those are now going to be the basis for why we focus on what the sages have done, because basically they have figured out the proper way to live life, to lead a good life, to cultivate yourself. And so that's an ethical sense of the notion of way, saying this is how you ought to live, this is how we ought to organize society. There also comes to be a metaphysical sense of what the term way can be used for. And with this metaphysical sense, way is what ultimately explains how the world is and how the world ought to be. So it serves something like, the notion of God in Christianity, what, explains why the world comes to be. And this will get emphasized particularly in Neo-Confucianism. This notion of way is not just something that's sort of just given out there in the universe and that we have to figure out how to follow it. So there's a passage in the Analects 15.29. Confucius says, "Human beings can broaden the way. It is not the way that broadens human beings." So think about continuing on that path of the way. The way is this road that goes on and on and on. You need human beings to walk it, to actually have it develop and have any sort of significance or meaning. So human beings give the way its meaning. So to conclude, we've seen that there's two metaphors, the metaphor of self-cultivation and then the metaphor of the way. And so we're left with some questions. If we think about those metaphors, what exactly is this way? What exactly is this path? And as we'll see, it's the path of virtue. And it's also the path of this other notion, the gentleman, which we can also translate in non-gender terms as the exemplary person. So this is kind of the ideal kind of person, the exemplar of the virtuous life. And so Analects 5.16 talks about the way of the gentleman. This is something that we all should become, and it's someone that has virtue, where virtue is this notion of power, that you have this kind of moral power, where you have this moral charisma to influence how others act. And of course, how influencing how others act is important for Confucianism, because the project is not limited to self-cultivation, but self-cultivation in order to make society better. So you need to cultivate yourself to have a good influence on others. And so in the next lectures, we're going to look at this notion of virtue and how you become an exemplary person.